hit everything but the oil. That's a direct line from President Trump about the strikes on Karg Island, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about this strange, deliberate restraint sitting underneath one of the most aggressive military campaigns in recent memory. Welcome back, everybody. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird demonstration pilot, and longtime commercial airline pilot. And today, we're breaking down Karg Island, Iran's single most important piece of economic real estate, the place that's been bombed repeatedly, threatened with outright seizure by name from the sitting president of the United States, and somehow, as of the most recent reporting available, is still standing and still exporting oil. Stick around, because by the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why a Hellfire missile got fired into a tanker's smokestack instead of sinking it outright, why 2 entire Marine units are already sitting in the region waiting on a decision that hasn't been made yet, and why one retired admiral says he'd be genuinely worried if that decision finally gets made. I want to walk you through exactly what's confirmed here because there's a lot of loud talk online about Karg Island getting wiped off the map, and that talk does not match what independent reporting and Iran's own state media are actually saying. So let's get into it. Sourced step by step. First, understand why this one tiny island matters so much that it keeps coming up again and again in nearly every major statement Trump makes about this entire war. Karg Island sits about 16 to 20 miles off Iran's Gulf Coast, roughly a third the size of Manhattan Island, and despite being that genuinely small, it handles somewhere around 90% of all of Iran's crude oil exports, close to 950 million barrels a year according to reporting from Al Jazeera. Oil from several of Iran's major offshore fields, including the Abuzar, Foruzan, and Dorud fields, gets piped underwater to Karg, loaded onto tankers there, and shipped out to the rest of the world, with China as by far the largest buyer, accounting for more than 11% of China's entire seaborne oil imports so far this year, according to that same reporting. U.S. officials have literally called it the nexus for all of Iran's entire oil supply chain, and that's not an exaggeration. It's closer to a plain factual description of reality. The island itself hosts 3 main energy infrastructure sites, including the Falat Iran Oil Company, which alone produces around 500,000 barrels of crude oil per day, along with the Karg Petrochemical Company. If you wanted to find the single point on the map where you could do the most economic damage to the Iranian regime with the least amount of actual bombing, Karg Island is basically it. And that's exactly why it's been hanging over this entire war, almost from day one, going all the way back to when Iraq repeatedly bombed the same island during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, specifically to try to choke off Iran's oil revenue and its ability to finance that earlier conflict, a piece of history that clearly hasn't been lost on anyone currently planning strikes there today. That earlier campaign back in the 80s never actually managed to fully shut the island down either, and Iran rebuilt and kept exporting even under sustained bombing back then, which is worth keeping in mind as a kind of historical baseline for just how resilient this specific piece of infrastructure has proven to be under military pressure over the decades. So here's the actual timeline of what's happened to it. And I want to go through this carefully because the details matter a lot more than the headlines suggest. On March 13th, the United States Air Force conducted a large-scale precision strike on Karg Island, and U.S. Central Command said the operation hit more than 90 separate Iranian military targets on the island, specifically naval mine storage facilities, missile storage bunkers, air defense systems, a naval base, an airport control tower, and a helicopter hangar. Iran's own Fars news agency confirmed strikes on those specific categories of targets. Iranian officials said more than 15 explosions were heard on the island, and an Iranian oil ministry official described the attack as enormous and destructive, resulting in nearly 2 hours of non-stop airstrikes and explosions that reportedly shook the entire island, and warning that any future strike on the island's actual oil and gas infrastructure would create severe economic consequences for the country and hinder much of Iran's oil export capacity going forward. It's worth pausing on that 2-hour window for a second, because that's an extraordinarily long sustained strike package for a single small island, and it tells you the scale of ordnance actually being delivered that night was massive, even though, according to every source on both sides, none of it touched the oil terminal itself. But here's the key detail that a lot of the more sensational coverage online conveniently leaves out. Iran's own damage assessment after that March strike found that no oil infrastructure had actually been hit. CENTCOM's own public statement on the strike, posted directly to their official account, explicitly said the operation destroyed military sites while preserving the oil infrastructure, in CENTCOM's own words, a level of specificity that tells you this wasn't an accident of targeting, but a deliberate constraint built into the mission. Planning from the very outset, agreed on well before the first bomb ever left an aircraft. Trump, in typical Trump fashion, posted that the strikes had totally demolished most of the island's military capability and then threatened to hit it a few more times just for fun. But even with that kind of rhetoric, Satellite imagery taken in the days immediately after the raid showed the terminal still actively being used, with 3 tankers moored there loading cargo like nothing catastrophic had happened to the export function of the island itself. A White House official also told the BBC around this same time that the United States military could, in their own words, take out Karg Island at any time it chose to, adding that while Trump had no current plans to send in troops, he retained all options as commander-in-chief, language that's clearly meant to keep the threat alive in Iranian planning, even without an actual escalation on the ground. Then in April, the U.S. struck Karg Island again hitting military targets specifically while leaving the oil facilities alone, according to White House sources cited in maritime industry reporting. A strike that came as part of the broader ongoing U.S.-Israel offensive against Iran that had launched back on February 28th. And then again on July 7th, as part of a broader wave of strikes tied to Iran's ongoing attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, explosions were reported on Karg Island once more, alongside strikes on Keshem Island and the port city of Bandar Abbas. Trump told reporters directly the following day that he'd instructed forces to knock out a piece of the island, but specifically said, quote, "Don't touch the oil," and confirmed that instruction had been followed. So across at least 3 separate rounds of strikes spanning March through July, roughly 4 months of recurring escalation, the pattern has been completely consistent every single time: hit the military infrastructure hard, repeatedly, and very deliberately leave the actual oil terminal functioning, almost like a dial that gets turned up whenever Iran does something provocative elsewhere, then held steady rather than pushed all the way to maximum. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a strategic standpoint, and this is the part of the story I think most casual coverage misses entirely. This wasn't restraint out of some sense of mercy or goodwill. It's restraint because destroying that terminal outright would be an act of economic self-harm on a genuinely global scale. Karg Island's oil moves through the world market, and a huge chunk of it, more than 11% of China's entire seaborne oil imports so far this year, comes through that single facility. If you actually destroyed the terminal instead of just threatening to, you'd be pulling a meaningful percentage of the entire planet's oil supply off the market overnight. And Brent crude has already jumped more than 5% in a single day just from Trump's verbal threats about the island, according to reporting from Al Jazeera. Actually, following through would send that number much, much higher, hurting everyone from Chinese refineries to gas prices at your local pump here at home, not just Iran. Think about that ripple effect for a second, because it's easy to think of an oil terminal on the other side of the world as someone else's problem. But energy markets are genuinely global, and a supply shock at Karg Island shows up within days as a real, tangible price increase practically everywhere fuel gets sold, including right here in the United States, which is exactly the kind of self-inflicted economic wound that makes any American president think twice before pulling that particular trigger, regardless of how satisfying it might feel rhetorically in a Truth Social post, and regardless of which party happens to be occupying the White House when that decision eventually has to get made. So the strategy, at least as it's played out so far, has been to demonstrate that the U.S. absolutely can hit Karg Island whenever it wants, hard, repeatedly, and with precision, while holding the actual killing blow, destruction of the export terminal itself, in reserve as a threat rather than cashing it in. If you're finding this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown useful and you want the real story instead of whatever exaggerated headline is trending this week, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because I'm going to keep tracking this one specifically. And the next update might be the one where the restraint actually breaks. Karg Island is genuinely one of the most important single flashpoints in this entire conflict, and it deserves ongoing, careful coverage rather than a one-time video that gets forgotten the next day. Let's talk about the seizure threat specifically, because that's actually been floated as a real considered military option, not just Trump talk for the cameras, and it's arguably the single most consequential open question in this entire story. According to CNN reporting citing multiple people familiar with both U.S. intelligence assessments and ongoing military planning discussions, the Trump administration has genuinely been weighing using U.S. troops to seize Karg Island outright, as leverage to force Iran back to the negotiating table on reopening the Strait of Hormuz for good. 2 Marine expeditionary units, which specialize in exactly this kind of rapid amphibious assault and raid mission, launching from Navy amphibious ships with their own aviation assets and landing craft attached, have deployed to the Middle East, along with roughly 1,000 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, expected to arrive in the region as well. White House officials reportedly believe that taking Karg would totally bankrupt the IRGC's revenue stream and could potentially force a swift resolution to the entire war. On paper, from a pure capability standpoint, retired Vice Admiral Robert Harward, a former deputy commander of U.S. Central Command who now advises on Iran policy for the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, told Fox News that Marines could likely seize the island itself in a matter of hours, given how small and lightly garrisoned it is relative to the forces the U.S. could bring to bear against it, describing it as, in his words, one of many ways to skin this particular cat. But here's the part that should make anyone pushing for that option pause, and it's the part I find most genuinely fascinating from a tactical perspective. Taking the island is reportedly the easy part. Holding it is an entirely different problem. Karg sits well within range of Iranian shore-based missiles, drones, and anti-ship weapons, and Iran has spent the recent weeks actively preparing for exactly this scenario, laying traps and moving additional military personnel and air defenses onto the island itself, including shoulder-fired man-pad systems, according to CNN's reporting, citing people familiar with U.S. intelligence. Those same sources noted the U.S. military maintains near constant overhead surveillance of the island, specifically to track physical and environmental changes consistent with defensive preparations, which is part of how this trap-laying activity was identified in the first place. Retired Admiral James Stavridis, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, put it about as bluntly as a career flag officer typically will in any public forum, saying he'd be very worried about an operation like this because, in his own words, Iranians are clever and ruthless. He also noted the earlier U.S. strikes had already degraded some of the island's air and sea defenses, including its Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries and Orlikon anti-aircraft guns, though clearly not to the point of eliminating the threat entirely, given Iran's continued reinforcement efforts. One Israeli intelligence source quoted in that same reporting raised a genuinely chilling possibility that if American forces did seize and hold the island, Iran's most rational response wouldn't be to try retaking it directly. It would be to fire on the oil infrastructure itself, since at that point there'd be nothing left to lose strategically, and doing so would inflict maximum economic pain on the very asset the U.S. was trying to protect by taking the island in the first place. That source said, the hope is Iran won't take that risk, but bluntly admitted, there's no way to actually know that in advance. It's also worth noting that Gulf allies have reportedly been privately urging the Trump administration against this exact move, worried that occupying the island would trigger high American casualties and prompt Iranian retaliation against Gulf infrastructure, prolonging a war those countries are desperate to see wound down rather than escalated further, and instead pressing U.S. officials to focus on dismantling Iran's ballistic missile program before any final resolution, a priority U.S. officials have reportedly agreed with in private briefings, suggesting there's at least some meaningful daylight between what regional partners on the ground actually want and what's being floated in Washington policy discussions. I want to pause here and give you my own honest analysis as someone who's had to think through exactly this kind of risk calculus in a military planning context, and I'll flag clearly that this next part is my opinion, not reported fact. An amphibious seizure of a small island target is genuinely one of the more straightforward things a modern expeditionary force can accomplish quickly. That part of Harward's assessment tracks with basically every serious analysis I have seen of comparable historical operations, going back to island seizures in the Pacific Theater in World War II, where the initial landing itself was frequently less costly in relative terms than what came after. The real vulnerability in any plan like this isn't the initial assault, it's the follow-on phase, the days and weeks after you've planted your flag, when you're now defending a small exposed piece of terrain against an adversary that knows the terrain intimately, has had weeks to prepare defenses and firing positions, and has a demonstrated willingness to absorb real losses rather than back down. Small island garrisons throughout military history have a rough track record specifically in that sustainment phase, not the initial landing. And everything in this reporting suggests senior U.S. military planners are keenly aware of exactly that risk, which is probably a meaningful part of why, as of the most recent reporting, this remains a threat under active consideration, rather than an operation that's actually been executed. I'd also add, purely from my own experience thinking through mission risk as a pilot who's had to fly in support of exactly these kinds of contested objectives, that holding a position under sustained drone and missile harassment is a fundamentally different and more grinding kind of operation than the dramatic, decisive strike footage that tends to dominate news coverage. It's not one big dramatic battle. It's an ongoing, exhausting exposure to intermittent, unpredictable attack, day after day. And that's exactly the kind of scenario that tends to produce a slow accumulation of casualties over weeks, rather than one clean, contained event, which is a much harder thing for any government to sell politically at home, regardless of how justified the original strategic logic might have been. There's also a piece of this that I think deserves real attention and doesn't get nearly enough of it, and that's an actual reported oil spill near the island. According to satellite imagery from the Copernicus Sentinel program, specifically the Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, and Sentinel-3 satellites, reviewed by researchers at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, a gray and white slick covering roughly 45 square kilometers was detected just west of the island back in early May, assessed by those researchers as visually consistent with an oil spill. and described as potentially the largest environmental incident of the entire conflict up to that point, some 70 days after the war itself had begun. Iranian officials denied any connection to military activity, attributing it instead to waste discharged from a European tanker operating in the area, according to reporting citing Iranian sources. I want to be very clear that I haven't seen independent confirmation settling that dispute one way or the other, and I'm not going to pretend I know definitively what caused that slick, but it's worth knowing that even with oil infrastructure supposedly being deliberately spared throughout this campaign, there's at least one documented environmental incident in the immediate vicinity of the island that remains unresolved and contested between Iranian officials and outside researchers, and that alone tells you something important, that even a strategy built around sparing the oil infrastructure doesn't guarantee zero environmental risk in an area this densely packed with pipelines, storage tanks, and constant tanker traffic, where even a near miss or an incidental accident tied to heightened military activity nearby could plausibly produce exactly this kind of visible slick, regardless of anyone's stated intentions. Let's talk about Iran's own public posture on all of this, because it's genuinely revealing. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, warned back in March that what he called Iran's enemies, with the support of one of the regional countries, were preparing to occupy one of the country's islands without directly naming Karg, though the context left little doubt about which island he meant. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi went further after the March raid and alleged that the bombing campaign against Karg had actually been launched from neighboring countries in the region rather than directly from American or Israeli territory, an accusation that those neighboring countries have pushed back on and firmly denied. And separately, Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid publicly stated last month that Israel should go much further than the current restrained approach, saying directly that Israel must destroy all of Iran's oil fields and energy industry on Karg Island, arguing that doing so is what would actually cripple Iran's economy and topple the regime outright. A notably more aggressive position than what the Trump administration has actually executed on the ground so far, and one that gives you a sense of the real disagreement between different voices in this conflict about just how far the campaign against Karg should actually go. It's worth sitting with that disagreement for a second, because it tells you this isn't a single unified coalition with one shared strategy. It's multiple governments with genuinely different risk tolerances and different definitions of what victory actually looks like, all operating in the same theater at the same time, which is exactly the kind of situation that can produce sudden, hard-to-predict escalation if one party decides to act unilaterally on their own preferred approach rather than waiting for consensus. Quick gut check before we keep going. Drop a comment right now with just the single word restraint if you think this pattern holds steady, or escalation. If you think one side breaks it soon, I genuinely want to see where this audience lands on that before I share my own prediction later on in this video. I also want to walk you through the disabled tanker incident because I think it's a really clear, concrete example of how this entire blockade strategy is actually being enforced day to day, beyond the headline strikes. After Trump reimposed the American naval blockade of Iranian ports, U.S. Central Command announced it had disabled an unladen oil tanker, the Curacao-flagged MT Belma, after the vessel allegedly tried to transit international waters toward Karg Island in defiance of multiple warnings. According to CENTCOM's own statement, a U.S. aircraft fired Hellfire missiles into the ship's smokestack specifically, disabling its propulsion without sinking the vessel outright or, as far as has been reported, causing crew casualties. And CENTCOM said afterward the ship was no longer transiting toward Iran. That's a genuinely precise, almost surgical way to enforce a blockade, targeting a ship's ability to move rather than destroying it wholesale. And it tells you something about how deliberately calibrated this entire enforcement effort has been, at least in this specific instance, compared to what a less restrained blockade enforcement operation might look like. I think it's actually a really instructive parallel to the broader Karg Island strategy itself, hit precisely enough to make the point and enforce the actual policy goal, without crossing over into the kind of indiscriminate destruction that would create a humanitarian or environmental disaster nobody involved actually wants attached to their name. Whether that same restraint holds if this conflict grinds on for months rather than weeks is a genuinely open question, and one I don't think anyone, including the people actually making these decisions in Washington, can answer with full confidence right now, especially as fatigue sets in on all sides, and the political incentive to just end things decisively starts competing with the incentive to keep things carefully contained. Now let me give you my honest read on where this whole Karg Island situation actually stands. And again, I'll flag this section clearly as my own analysis rather than settled fact. I think the pattern here is pretty clearly intentional escalation management, not indecision, whatever it might look like from the outside to someone just scrolling headlines between other stories. The US has demonstrated, repeatedly and with real teeth, that it has the capability to hit essentially anything on that island whenever it chooses. 90-plus targets destroyed in a single raid back in March alone. then again in April, then again in July. At the same time, the deliberate, repeated, publicly stated decision to leave the oil terminal itself standing tells you the administration understands that actually destroying it would be an economic weapon that cuts in every direction at once, not just against Iran, and Trump himself has been explicit about that exact calculation more than once in public statements, going as far as attaching a moral framing to it, calling it a decision made for reasons of decency rather than pure strategic calculation. The seizure option remains, as far as publicly available reporting shows, a real contingency that's being actively planned for, with actual Marine and Army units already forward, deployed and postured for exactly that kind of operation. But the risk profile, Stavridis and Harward both laid out for the sustainment phase, not the initial assault, appears to be the real thing holding that decision back, rather than any lack of confidence in the ability to actually take the island in the first place. I think the honest, most likely outcome here in the near term, and I want to stress this is speculation on my part, is that Karg Island keeps functioning as exactly what it's already become, a recurring pressure point that gets hit hard every time Iran escalates elsewhere, like attacking ships in the Strait of Hormuz or striking U.S. bases in the Gulf, without crossing into either full destruction of the oil terminal or an actual ground seizure. Unless something changes the fundamental risk calculus on one side or the other. That could change fast, though. If Iran's retaliatory strikes against U.S. partners in the region get significantly more lethal, or if there's a direct American casualty event tied to Karg specifically, or if oil prices start climbing for reasons unrelated to Karg at all, and Washington starts looking for a decisive way to shock the market back down, I'd expect the political pressure inside Washington to escalate past that current restraint fairly quickly. And that's exactly the kind of tripwire moment worth watching closely if you want to understand where this specific thread of the war goes next. Let me also spend a minute on what I think doesn't get enough attention in all of this, and that's the sheer number of people whose livelihoods run through that one small island, completely separate from the geopolitics. Every tanker crew loading cargo at Karg, every worker maintaining that pipeline network stretching underwater from Iran's major offshore fields, every family in Iran depending on oil revenue that ultimately funnels back through the government's budget for basic services like electricity, water treatment, and hospitals, all of that sits directly underneath a piece of infrastructure that multiple governments have now explicitly discussed destroying or seizing as a strategic lever in a war those individual workers had no part in starting. I think it's easy, when you're talking through target sets and strategic calculus like I've been doing through most of this video, to lose sight of the fact that Karg Island isn't just a symbol or a pressure point on a map, it's an actual functioning workplace for a lot of ordinary people. Right now, today, even in the middle of all of this, somewhere on that island right now, assuming operations really are continuing close to normal like Iranian state media has reported, there are dock workers loading crude onto tankers, maintenance crews checking pipeline pressure, and probably more than a few people glancing nervously at the sky every time an unfamiliar aircraft noise passes overhead, wondering if today's the day the restraint finally runs out. That's a genuinely uncomfortable way to have to go to work every single day. And I don't think it gets nearly enough acknowledgement and coverage that's mostly focused on troop deployments and strike statistics, headline numbers that can make it easy to forget there are real people standing on that ground every time one of these numbers gets reported. If you want the deeper dives on stories like this, the moment new information actually gets confirmed, rather than after the fact, once everyone else has already moved on to the next headline, go ahead and share this video with one person you know who's been confused by the louder, less careful takes floating around. That's honestly the single most useful thing you can do to help more people get the accurate version of this story instead of the exaggerated one. So here's where things actually stand with Karg Island as of the most recent confirmed reporting. The island has been struck by U.S. forces on at least 3 separate occasions since March, hitting more than 90 military targets in the first raid alone, while the actual oil export terminal has been deliberately spared each time, a fact confirmed independently by both U.S. Central Command's own statements and Iran's own state-affiliated media reporting minimal damage to maritime infrastructure. Trump has repeatedly and publicly floated the idea of seizing the island outright, and real military assets, Marine expeditionary units, and Army airborne troops have been forward positioned in a way consistent with that option being seriously considered, rather than just rhetorical. Iran, for its part, has visibly prepared defenses on the island itself in anticipation of exactly that kind of operation, moving in additional personnel, air defenses, and shoulder-fired missile systems. An unresolved oil spill near the island remains a genuinely open question that neither side has definitively settled, and a naval blockade enforced with precise, individually targeted strikes on specific vessels, like the disabled tanker we talked about earlier, rather than a blanket assault, continues to be the primary tool actually being used to choke off Iranian oil movement through the island right now, rather than an outright destruction of the terminal itself. Karg Island has absolutely been hit, repeatedly and hard. It has not been erased, and as of everything that's actually been confirmed and reported, it's still standing, still loading tankers, and still very much the single most important piece of leverage either side has left to play in this entire conflict. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through. I know this was a deep dive, but Karg Island is genuinely one of the most important single threads to understand if you want to actually make sense of where this whole war might be headed next, rather than just reacting to whatever headline shows up in your feed today. Drop a comment and let me know whether you think the US ultimately goes through with a seizure of the island, or whether this restrained, strike but don't destroy pattern just keeps repeating indefinitely. I read every single one of these, and I'm genuinely curious what you all think, given everything we just walked through together. And if you called it earlier with your one-word restraint or escalation comment, I want to know if this deep dive changed your mind at all. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch it the moment something actually changes on this specific story, and I'll see you in the next one.